Richard Sterling considered the Thanksgiving table a map of his own success. The 20-pound turkey, glistening under the recessed lighting of the cavernous dining room, was a testament to his financial prowess. The baccarat crystal glasses, each ringing with the clarity of a church bell, reflected the faces of a family he had built, a dynasty he controlled. At the head of the table he was a king surveying his domain. His wife, Eleanor, sat to his right, a portrait of practiced elegance in pearls and cashmere. His son Marcus sat opposite, a younger, softer version of Richard, already wearing the smug confidence of an heir apparent. And then, at the far end of the table, next to his daughter Sarah, was the anomaly, the smudge on the masterpiece, Elias Vance. Richard looked at his son-in-law with a familiar, weary cocktail of pity and contempt. He saw a man in a simple, off-the-rack suit that was just a little too loose in the shoulders. He saw a man who drove a sensible, 10-year-old sedan. He saw an architect who, in Richard's mind, probably designed kitchen extensions in backyard sheds. A man who called his meager efforts a practice. Richard saw a failure. A man who had somehow managed to charm his daughter, but had failed at the one thing that truly mattered, the acquisition of wealth and status. He and his family had a name for Elias, a little joke they shared in text messages and quiet asides when he was out of the room. They called him the broke one. What Richard Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend in his fortress of arrogance, was that the quiet architect at his table was the only reason his own fortress was still standing. He didn't know that within the hour, his entire world, built on a foundation of debt and delusion, was about to be saved or shattered by the very man he so casually dismissed. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever had your worth judged by the contents of your wallet instead of the content of your character, then you know the quiet storm gathering behind Elias's calm eyes. We love seeing stories where the tables are turned, where dignity and integrity win the day. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and stick around because the Thanksgiving dinner at the Sterling house is about to serve a main course of justice, and it's going to be delicious. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and unspoken resentments. Elias could feel the weight of the Sterling family's judgment pressing down on him, as tangible as the heavy damask tablecloth beneath his elbows. He kept his posture straight, his hands resting in his lap. Beside him, his wife Sarah shifted in her seat, the tiny, nervous movement a familiar signal of her discomfort. She loved him, he knew that, but in this house she became a different person, quieter, more subdued, a reflection of her parents' expectations. Her loyalty was a rope being pulled from two opposite ends, and Elias could feel it fraying with every condescending word her family uttered. "Marcus," Richard began, his voice booming as he carved another thick slice of turkey, "tell everyone about the new downtown tower. A landmark, that's what it's going to be. A Sterling landmark." Marcus puffed out his chest. "Well, Dad, the initial groundwork is done. We've secured the zoning variances, which was no small feat. Now it's just a matter of locking in the final investors and, of course, signing the lead architect. We're aiming for the best, someone with vision." He glanced down the table at Elias, a smirk playing on his lips. "No offense, Elias. I'm sure your residential projects are very charming." The insult, wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness, landed right on target. It was designed to diminish him, to place his life's work in a small, insignificant box labeled hobby. Elias met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "None taken, Marcus. A project of that scale requires a very specific skill set." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Under his chair, his foot rested against the corner of a simple, worn leather portfolio. It was unassuming, just like him, but inside it held a universe of vision that Marcus and his father could never imagine. Eleanor, ever the orchestrator of social discomfort, chimed in. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, I do hope you two are managing all right. This city is just so terribly expensive. I saw your car out front. Is the air conditioning still making that dreadful noise? Richard, we should really do something for them. A proper Christmas bonus. Sarah's face flushed a deep crimson. Mom, please, we're fine. Elias's firm is doing very well. Of course, dear, Eleanor said, patting her hand in the air as if to soothe a hysterical child. It's just, we worry. We want you to have the best, the life you were accustomed to. The implication was clear. The life she had now, with Elias, was a downgrade. Every word was a carefully sharpened knife, intended to carve away at their happiness, to isolate Sarah and make her question her choices. Elias reached under the table and placed his hand on his wife's knee. It was a small gesture of reassurance, a silent promise that he was there, that they were a team, even if she couldn't find the words to fight back in this house. He felt her leg tremble slightly. She was trapped, and her silence was a secondary betrayal he had learned to endure, though it never lost its sting. We appreciate your concern, Eleanor, Elias said, his voice even and calm. He was a master of emotional containment. He had learned long ago that reacting with anger was a concession of power. But we are very happy. Our life is full. Success isn't always measured by the height of a building. Richard let out a short, barking laugh. Spoken like a man who doesn't build tall buildings, he said, and Marcus joined in with a sycophantic chuckle. The joke hung in the air, another layer of humiliation for Sarah to absorb and for Elias to deflect. Elias simply smiled, a serene, almost unnerving expression that gave nothing away. He took a sip of water, the cool liquid a welcome contrast to the heated undercurrents of the conversation. He had been enduring these dinners for 5 years. 5 years of thinly veiled insults, of being treated as a charity case, of watching his wife shrink in the presence of her family. In the beginning, it had enraged him. He had argued with Sarah in the car on the way home, demanding to know why she didn't defend him, why she didn't defend them. He had learned, over time, that her silence came not from a lack of love, but from a lifetime of emotional conditioning. To defy her father was, in her mind, a kind of cataclysm she wasn't yet strong enough to survive. So he had changed his strategy. He became an observer, a collector of data. He listened to Richard's boasts about his company, Sterling Enterprises, and he listened to Marcus's preening about his own minor accomplishments. He listened to their casual cruelty, their obsession with status symbols, their complete inability to see the value in anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. And all the while, he was planning, not a revenge, but a recalibration, a necessary correction to a system that was fundamentally broken. The leather portfolio by his feet contained the initial concept sketches for the Sterling Tower. Not just sketches, but a complete architectural vision, from the foundational engineering to the sustainable energy systems, to the very aesthetic that would redefine the city's skyline. It was the work of Ethelred, the enigmatic, world-renowned architect whom Richard Sterling was desperately courting, offering an exorbitant fee and complete creative control. Ethelred, the architect who only communicated through his legal team, who had never shown his face, whose real name was a closely guarded secret. Ethelred, who was currently eating a dry piece of turkey at the end of Richard Sterling's dining table. So, Elias, Richard said, changing tactics as he gestured with a fork. What's on the books for you next year? Remodeling a bathroom? Designing a new deck for some suburbanite? He was relentless, a predator sensing weakness. Before Elias could answer, Sarah spoke up, her voice small but determined. Elias just won a grant to study sustainable urban living. He's developing new materials. Marcus cut her off with a wave of his hand. Grants, that's nice. Charity work, essentially. Meanwhile, we're building empires. He looked at his father for approval and received a proud nod. Dad, speaking of empires, have you heard back from Ethelred's people? We need to get him under contract before the new year. Richard's mood soured slightly. His lawyers are playing hardball, demanding terms you wouldn't believe. Complete control, final say on all contractors, and a percentage of gross, not net. Audacious. But, he sighed, he's the best. The board is convinced he's the only one who can attract the kind of prestige investors we need. Without him, the whole project is on shaky ground. This was the first thread of truth Elias had heard all evening. He knew, from his own quiet due diligence, that shaky ground was a massive understatement. Sterling Enterprises was leveraged to the absolute limit. The downtown tower wasn't a vanity project. It was a desperate gamble to save the company from insolvency. The bank loans were contingent on securing a world-class architect and a major infusion of outside capital. Without Aethelred, the company would collapse within 6 months. Elias watched Richard's face, seeing the flicker of fear behind the bravado. The man was terrified, and he was hiding it the only way he knew how, by puffing himself up and pushing others down. He felt a sliver of something that wasn't quite pity, but a profound sadness for a man so trapped by his own ego that he couldn't see the lifeline sitting right in front of him. "Well," Elias said, placing his napkin on the table, "I'm sure it will all work out. Men of vision usually get what they want." The statement was perfectly neutral, but the look in his eyes held a depth of meaning that was entirely lost on Richard and Marcus. They heard only the words and interpreted them as the weak platitude of a man who knew nothing of their world. They could not see the chess master sitting across from them, patiently waiting for the moment to say, "Checkmate." The dinner wore on, a slow-motion ordeal of boasts and barbs. Marcus recounted a recent trip to Monaco, detailing the yachts and the casinos with a tedious precision meant to highlight his own sophistication. Eleanor lamented the difficulty of finding good help for their summer home in the Hamptons. Richard held forth on the failures of the current political administration, which he blamed for the economic headwinds his company was facing, never once admitting to his own reckless expansion and poor management. Through it all, Elias was a picture of calm. He ate his food slowly. He listened politely. He offered non-committal responses. He was building a wall of quiet dignity around himself, a fortification they could not breach with their petty insults. Inside that wall, however, his mind was racing. He was cataloging every slight, every condescending remark, not for the purpose of retribution, but for clarity. When the time came, he would need to articulate exactly why things were about to change. He would need to hold up a mirror to these people, and the reflection would have to be undeniable. The tension between him and Sarah was a silent, humming wire. He could feel her watching him, her expression a mixture of love, guilt, and frustration. She wanted to be the woman who stood up and screamed, "Stop it! Stop treating my husband this way!" But the voice of her father, ingrained in her since childhood, was louder. It whispered that he knew best, that their wealth was a shield, that Elias was, for all his kindness and intelligence, a step down. It was a poison she had been drinking her whole life, and she hadn't yet found the antidote. The catalyst for the evening's main event arrived with dessert. A pumpkin cheesecake, elaborate and ostentatious like everything else in the house, was served. As Marcus was boasting about the new Porsche he was getting for Christmas, Richard turned his attention once more to Elias. "Speaking of gifts," Richard said, a magnanimous, patronizing smile spreading across his face. "Eleanor and I know things can be a bit tight. We wanted to help you out. A little something to show you're still family." He slid a slim, elegant envelope across the table. It stopped just short of Elias's plate. The entire table went quiet. Sarah stared at the envelope as if it were a scorpion. "Dad, don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Nonsense, sweetheart," Richard said jovially. "It's what family does. We help those who are less fortunate." The phrase hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Less fortunate. Elias looked at the envelope, then at Richard's smug face. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, waiting for his reaction. They expected gratitude. They expected him to be humbled, perhaps even a little embarrassed, by this public display of charity. He felt a surge of cold anger, but he pushed it down, compressing it into a diamond-hard point of resolve. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He simply held it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight. He knew what was inside. A check for a few $1,000s. An amount that was simultaneously insulting in its smallness to Richard and intended to be a fortune to Elias. It was an act of dominance, a clear statement of his perceived place in the family hierarchy. "Thank you, Richard," Elias said, his voice perfectly level. The use of Richard's first name, rather than Dad or Mr. Sterling, was a subtle shift, a reclaiming of distance. "This is very thoughtful." He did not put the envelope in his pocket. He placed it on the table next to his plate, a silent testament to the transaction that had just occurred. It sat there, a white rectangle of condescension. Richard, satisfied that he had established his dominance once again, leaned back in his chair. "Well, good. Now about that architect, Athelred." It was in that moment, as the name Athelred was spoken again, that the doorbell chimed. The sound, clear and sonorous, cut through the tense atmosphere of the dining room. Everyone froze. They weren't expecting anyone else. "Who on earth could that be?" Eleanor murmured, dabbing her lips with a napkin. A housekeeper appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the interruption. There is a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Finch. He says it's urgent." Richard frowned, annoyed at the interruption, but also intrigued. Finch. The name sounded familiar. Finch. Finch. From the law firm representing Ethelred? He asked, a spark of excitement in his eyes. He thought his aggressive offer had finally paid off. "He must be here to accept our terms. Send him in. Send him in at once." A wide, triumphant grin spread across Richard's face. He looked at Marcus, who mirrored his expression. Their gamble was about to pay off. Their empire was saved. He felt a surge of power, of invincibility. He glanced down the table at Elias in the pitying envelope. The contrast was perfect. At one end of the table, a king receiving news of a great victory. At the other, a pauper receiving a handout. The housekeeper returned, followed by a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. He had silver hair, a calm, professional demeanor, and carried a sleek, black briefcase. This was Alistair Finch. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice crisp and precise, "forgive the intrusion on your holiday." "Not at all, Finch, not at all," Richard boomed, rising from his chair and extending a hand. "Come in, have a drink. I assume you have good news for me regarding our mutual interest in Mr. Athelred?" Alistair Finch completely ignored Richard's outstretched hand. His eyes scanned the table, passing over Eleanor, Marcus, and Sarah, before they settled, with polite recognition, on Elias. The entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. Finch walked the length of the long dining table, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the thick Persian rug. He bypassed the sputtering Richard and came to a stop directly behind Elias's chair. "Mr. Vance," he said, his tone respectful, professional. "I have the final signature pages for the acquisition as we discussed. I apologize for the timing, but the sellers in Zurich were insistent on closing before their markets opened." Silence. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the room. Richard stood frozen, his hands still hanging in the air. Marcus's smug grin had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of utter confusion. Eleanor stared, her fork halfway to her mouth. Sarah looked back and forth between the lawyer and her husband, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying, wonderful suspicion. Elias slowly turned in his chair to face the lawyer. He reached down and retrieved the worn leather portfolio from the floor. He placed it on the table, setting it next to the condescending white envelope from Richard. The juxtaposition was stark. One represented perceived value, the other, true power. "Thank you for coming, Alistair," Elias said, his voice carrying a new weight, an authority that no one at the table had ever heard from him before. Everything is in order? Perfectly, Finch confirmed, opening his briefcase and producing a sheaf of documents bound in a dark blue cover. The final transfer of the controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises' outstanding debt is complete. The holding company is now yours. You just need to sign the directive. Richard made a choking sound, a strangled gasp. My company's debt? What are you talking about? Vance, what is this nonsense? Elias didn't look at Richard. He kept his focus on the documents, his expression calm and analytical. It's not nonsense, Richard. It's business. He took a pen from Alistair Finch, a heavy, expensive fountain pen. For the past 18 months, as your company has been taking on more and more debt to finance the tower project, a private equity firm has been quietly buying that debt from the lenders. That firm, as of an hour ago, is now under my complete control. Marcus finally found his voice. You? You don't have that kind of money. This is insane. You're a nobody. Elias finally lifted his eyes from the papers. He looked directly at Marcus, and for the first time, the mask of placid humility was gone. In its place was a look of such immense, unshakable authority that Marcus physically recoiled. The mistake you and your father have always made, Elias said, his voice cutting through the silence, is assuming that what you see is all there is. You judge me by my car, by my suit, by the modest home Sarah and I chose to live in because we value peace over ostentation. You never once thought to ask about my work. Not really. He gestured to the leather portfolio. You've been desperately trying to hire an architect named Athelred. Richard's face went pale. What do you know about Athelred? I know everything about him, Elias said. He unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a large, beautifully rendered drawing of a magnificent, twisting skyscraper that seemed to reach for the heavens. It was the Sterling Tower, but rendered with a genius and vision that the company's own architects could only dream of. He laid it on the table. Because I am Athelred. The revelation landed, not like a bomb, but like the sudden, total absence of sound. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the arrogance, all the certainty out of the room. Eleanor dropped her fork, and it clattered onto her plate with a deafening noise. Richard stared at the drawing, his mind refusing to connect the broke son-in-law he'd been mocking for years with the mythical, godlike architect he had been worshipping from afar. No, Richard whispered. That's not possible. Oh, it's very possible, Elias continued, his voice relentless. My firm, Vance Architectural Solutions, is a small, boutique practice, just as you always assumed. It's what I do for enjoyment. Athelred is the name I use for my commercial work, my legacy projects. It's a separate entity, managed by a team in Geneva, designed to protect my privacy. A privacy I value very much, though you've made it difficult to maintain. He then picked up the small white envelope Richard had given him. He held it up. You offered me this as a bonus, a handout to the less fortunate member of the family. Let's call it a few $1,000s. Alistair, he said, turning to the lawyer, what was the total value of the Sterling Enterprises debt package we just acquired? Finch didn't hesitate. $274 million, Mr. Vance. The number was so vast, so incomprehensible in that context, that it barely registered. It was like trying to imagine the distance to a star. Richard stumbled backward and collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. Elias placed the envelope back on the table. You see, there's a difference in scale here that you are fundamentally unable to grasp, and that is the root of the problem. He stood up, walking slowly around the table until he stood behind his wife's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. Sarah was trembling, not with fear, but with a seismic shift of her entire reality. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a million questions, but also with a fierce, dawning pride. For 5 years, Elias began, his voice now taking on a new cadence, the quiet authority of a judge delivering a verdict. This was his list of grievances, delivered not with malice, but with the cold, hard finality of truth. For 5 years I have sat at this table and listened. I listened when you, Richard, called my work designing decks and laughed at my professional aspirations. I listened when you, Eleanor, made passive-aggressive remarks about our lifestyle, implying my wife was suffering because of my inability to provide. I listened when you, Marcus, nicknamed me the broke one and mocked the car I drive, a car I keep because it was my father's, a fact you never bothered to learn. He paused, letting the words sink in. You never asked about my parents. You never asked about my past. You never asked a single meaningful question about who I am. You simply looked at my bank statement, or what you imagined my bank statement to be, and you passed your judgment. You decided I was worthless. He looked directly at Richard. You are a man who worships at the altar of money. You believe it is the ultimate measure of a man. So let's talk in terms you can understand. The project you believe will be your legacy, the Sterling Tower, was designed by me. The financing that keeps your company from imploding is controlled by me. The very roof over your head is, in a very real sense, mortgaged to me. He let that final statement hang in the air for a long, brutal moment. The king was a king no longer. He was a supplicant, a debtor in his own dining room. This isn't about revenge, Elias said, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its power. It's about respect. It's about the simple, human decency you denied me because you were blinded by your own arrogance. You wanted to do business with Aethelred, but you couldn't be bothered to be kind to Elias Vance. And now you see, they are one and the same. Richard finally broke. The bluster, the arrogance, the carefully constructed persona of the titan of industry crumbled into dust. He looked like a frail, terrified old man. What do you want? He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. What are you going to do? Elias looked down at the documents Alistair Finch had placed before him. That, he said, picking up the fountain pen, is what we are about to decide. The pen hovered over the signature line, a weapon more powerful than any sword, ready to rewrite the future of the entire Sterling family. The silence that followed was a living entity, thick with disbelief and the shattering of long-held illusions. Richard Sterling, a man whose voice had commanded boardrooms and intimidated rivals for 40 years, now sat shrunken in his high-backed chair, his face the color of old parchment. Marcus was staring at Elias as if seeing a ghost, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of his ne'er-do-well brother-in-law with the financial titan who now held his family's fate in his hands. Eleanor seemed to be in a state of shock, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Only Sarah moved. She slowly rose from her chair, her eyes locked on Elias. She walked around the table and stood beside him, her hand finding his. It was an act of profound and final alignment. In that single, simple gesture, she crossed a chasm that had separated them for years, leaving her family and their toxic values on the other side. She had made her choice. Elias, she said, her voice clear and strong, devoid of the hesitation that had always plagued her in this house. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Elias squeezed her hand, a wave of relief and love washing over him. This was the victory that mattered most. The rest was just business. He turned his attention back to Richard. What do I want? He repeated the man's desperate question. I want to build my tower, the one I designed, not the compromised, budget-cut version you and your board were planning, but the real one, the one that will be a testament to architectural integrity and sustainable design, not just a monument to corporate greed. Alistair Finch, ever the calm professional, interjected smoothly. If I may, Mr. Vance, the terms of the debt covenants you now control give you the authority to restructure the board of Sterling Enterprises and assume operational oversight of all major projects, effective immediately. Richard's head snapped up. You can't. You can't just take my company. I'm not taking it, Elias corrected him gently. I'm saving it. From you. Your leadership has driven it to the brink of bankruptcy. Your reckless gambles and your refusal to listen to wiser counsel have put the jobs of over 500 employees at risk. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for them and for the integrity of my own design. He finally signed the document with a series of fluid, confident strokes. The ink was black and final. Alistair, please see that this is filed first thing in the morning. I want a general meeting with the Sterling Enterprises executive team at 9 a.m. sharp. Of course, Mr. Vance, Finch said, gathering the papers and placing them securely in his briefcase. You're firing me, Marcus blurted out, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his thick skull. From my own family's company? Your father's company, Elias corrected. And yes, your position as vice president of needless projects is hereby terminated. So is your father's role as CEO. The board will be reconstituted. New leadership, chosen for competence rather than nepotism, will be installed. The cruelty of it was its sheer dispassionate logic. Elias wasn't being vindictive. He was being a responsible business owner. He was fixing a problem. The fact that the problem was his arrogant family was incidental. What about us? Eleanor's voice was thin and reedy, all its imperious tone gone. What will happen to us? Elias looked at her, and for a moment he saw not the society matron who had belittled him, but a frightened woman whose entire identity was tied to a status she was about to lose. You won't be destitute, he said. Richard will be given a severance package, a generous one by any normal standard. It will be enough for a comfortable retirement. You'll have to sell this house, of course, and the place in the Hamptons. You'll need to learn to live on a budget, a real one. He paused. It will be a simpler life, the kind you were so worried Sarah was being forced to endure. The parallel structure of his words, the way he turned her own condescending phrases back on her, was devastating. It wasn't an insult, it was a mirror. He was showing them exactly who they were, forcing them to confront the reflection of their own prejudice. Richard put his head in his hands. A dry, ragged sob escaped his lips. The king was broken. His kingdom had been conquered not by an enemy army, but by a quiet architect he had failed to see. Alistair Finch gave a slight bow. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, I'll take my leave. My office will be in touch tomorrow to arrange the transition. With that, he turned and walked out of the dining room, his departure as quiet and efficient as his arrival. The four of them, Elias, Sarah, and her shattered parents, were left in the wreckage of their Thanksgiving dinner. The magnificent turkey sat uneaten. The expensive wine was untouched. The whole scene was a tableau of ruin. It was Sarah who spoke first. She looked at her parents, her expression not triumphant, but deeply sad. All you had to do was be kind, she said softly. That's all he ever wanted, for you to see him, the man I love, and just be kind. But you couldn't do it. She turned and took Elias's hand again. Let's go home. Yes, Elias said. Let's go home. He didn't look back at Richard or Eleanor. He didn't need to. He had said everything that needed to be said. As they walked out of the grand dining room, past the stunned housekeeper, and through the cavernous marble foyer, Elias felt a profound sense of release. It was the end of a long, silent war he had never wanted to fight. The car ride home was quiet at first. The city lights streamed past the windows of the 10-year-old sedan, the same car Marcus had mocked just hours earlier. It felt solid and real, a humble vessel carrying them away from a world of illusion. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blur of light and color, her thoughts a whirlwind. Finally, she turned to him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice gentle without accusation. The full extent of it. I knew you were successful, that you had your Aethelred projects, but I had no idea. about any of this. Elias kept his eyes on the road. Because I needed you to choose me, he said simply. Not Aethelred, not the money or the power, just me, Elias, the quiet architect your family thought was a failure. If I had told you everything, your family would have suddenly changed their tune. They would have fawned over me, praised me, but it wouldn't have been real. Their respect would have been for my wealth, not for my character. And I would never have known if you were staying with me for love or because it was suddenly the easy, approved of thing to do. He glanced at her, his expression open and vulnerable. I had to know that you could love the broke one. And tonight, when you stood up and took my hand, before you even knew the full story, you did. You chose me. That's all I ever really wanted. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but they were tears of understanding, of catharsis. I'm so sorry, Elias, she whispered. I'm so sorry I was so weak for so long. I was so afraid of them, of their disapproval. I let them hurt you. They didn't hurt me, he said, reaching over to take her hand. They underestimated me. There's a difference. And you're not weak, Sarah. You were conditioned. Tonight, you broke that conditioning. You found your own voice. That's the strongest thing a person can do. They drove the rest of the way in a comfortable, healing silence, their hands clasped together. When they arrived at their home, a modest but beautifully designed house in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood, it felt more like a sanctuary than ever before. It was a home built on love and mutual respect, not on square footage or market value. As they walked inside, leaving the drama and the wreckage of the Sterling dynasty behind them, they were finally, truly free. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of controlled demolition and careful reconstruction. Elias, acting with swift and decisive precision, dismantled the corrupt and inefficient upper management of Sterling Enterprises. Richard Sterling was forced into retirement, his departure announced in a bland press release that spoke of a desire to spend more time with his family. Marcus was unceremoniously fired, his corporate credit cards canceled, and his access to the executive washroom revoked. He found himself for the first time in his 35 years having to write a resume. Elias installed a new CEO, a brilliant woman he had worked with on a project in Singapore, known for her sharp mind and ethical leadership. He restructured the company's finances, renegotiating the very debt he now held to give the company breathing room. He met with the employees, assuring them that their jobs were safe, and that the company's new direction would be one of innovation and integrity, not reckless speculation. He became a savior to the very people whose livelihoods his father-in-law had nearly destroyed. The Sterling Tower project, now officially the Aethelred Tower, was put back on track, this time according to Elias's original, uncompromised vision. The city's architectural community buzzed with excitement. The identity of Aethelred was now public, and Elias Vance went from being a relative unknown to a celebrated visionary overnight. He handled the newfound fame with the same quiet dignity he had displayed at the Thanksgiving table. For Richard and Eleanor, the fall was as swift as it was brutal. They sold the mansion at a loss to cover personal debts Richard had hidden from everyone. They sold the Hamptons house. The fleet of luxury cars was repossessed. They moved into a small, respectable condominium in a suburb, a place Eleanor described to her few remaining friends as cozy, a word she uttered with a barely concealed shudder. Their social circle evaporated. They were no longer the power couple at the center of the city's elite. They were a cautionary tale, whispered about at cocktail parties. Richard, stripped of his title and his power, seemed to age a decade in a matter of months. He spent his days watching financial news on television, a ghost haunting the memory of his former life. Eleanor busied herself with trivialities, trying to maintain the fiction of her former status. But the illusion was thin and unconvincing. They were truly, for the first time, less fortunate. One evening, about 3 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, Sarah found Elias standing in his home office, looking at a framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of his parents, a smiling, kind-faced couple standing in front of a modest, well-tended garden. "I was just thinking about them," Elias said as Sarah wrapped her arms around him from behind. "My father was a carpenter, a master craftsman. He taught me that the strength of a structure isn't in its ornamentation, but in its foundation. He taught me to measure twice and cut once, to respect the materials, to build things that last." He turned to face her. "Your family, they built an elaborate facade, but their foundation was rotten. It was built on pride, greed, and disrespect. A structure like that can't stand. It was bound to collapse." "And us?" Sarah asked softly. "What are we building?" Elias smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "We're building something that lasts," he said, kissing her forehead. "Something with a strong foundation." A year later, the Athelred Tower was a gleaming jewel in the city's skyline, a symbol of architectural genius and urban renewal. Elias and Sarah stood on the observation deck of their real home, a stunning, minimalist masterpiece of glass and stone that Elias had designed himself, nestled in a secluded bit of coastline an hour from the city. It was a home that whispered wealth rather than shouting it, a place of peace and quiet strength. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother. After months of strained silence, Eleanor had begun to reach out, sending tentative, awkward messages. This one was a picture of a small, lopsided birthday cake. The caption read, "Your father learned to bake. It's not perfect, but it's a start." It wasn't an apology, not in words, but it was a flicker of something new, humility, an acknowledgement of a life that wasn't about appearances, but about small, genuine efforts. Perhaps, Elias thought, redemption wasn't about grand gestures, but about learning to bake a lopsided cake. It was a start. He looked out at the ocean, the endless expanse of blue meeting the sky. He had not set out to destroy the Sterlings, only to protect his wife and his own integrity. The consequences they faced were not of his design, but of their own. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered the glass house they lived in. True worth, he reflected, is not something that can be displayed or flaunted. It is quiet, internal, and forged in integrity. It is the solid foundation that allows you to withstand any storm, to face any insult with grace, and to know, with unshakable certainty, who you are. The Sterlings had only valued a price tag, and in their blindness, they never bothered to check the true cost of their arrogance. What do you think? Was Elias's response the right one? Was it justice, or was it a cold form of revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We believe that character is the currency that truly matters. And if you agree, don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more tales where the underestimated find their voice and true worth wins the day.